on his threat to take action, strong action against Russia and Vladimir Putin. Well, that pretty much just evaporated to talk about keeping the war or allowing the war to continue as it is, and when action comes, as and when it comes, if it comes, looking at punishing both sides. It takes us to a different place. Those expectations will now have to be completely recalibrated, won't they? We did hear on a rare occasion when Friedrich Merz got a word in edgeways. He didn't seem to me as if he was keen to butt in, by the way. Maybe that's not a bad way of handling an encounter like this with Donald Trump. But when he did come in, he did assert his wish to see action taken against Russia, and action taken now. And that was, if you like, something of a carefully worded rebuttal to what we've just heard from Donald Trump. I mean, Nick Alipur, there were other things there too, by the way, which I do at some point want to bring in. Interesting words on China, which was in itself rather something of a story. But I mean, this position, Nick, on Ukraine, it's so far removed from what Germany and the German leader certainly want to see.
Absolutely, and you could, Mads wasn't much of a, also wasn't very confrontative either. You could say he was really licking Trump's boots a tiny bit here. So not at all a strong, self-confident figure like we've seen Macron in the Oval Office. But he did try sort of to stir the president in the direction of, you've ended a war before. There was D-Day. It's actually something that where America did a great job liberating Europe, and he did try to give him those cues, but Trump didn't really take the bait, I think, here. It's not what Merz wanted to hear for sure. He will probably bring it up again now that they speak in private. And yes. I'm really curious to hear the statement of the Chancellor afterwards, because there is going to be one. And he will have to tell the German journalists, what did Trump tell you about Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, and that's what the rest, all of Ukraine's friends will have to study. Not that it takes a great deal of study to follow what was said by President Trump. They will be disappointed. Their hopes of President Trump intervening, with force against Russia to bring about some sort of negotiation will not, frankly, have been high. I think, privately, one can easily imagine their hopes of that were very limited indeed. President Trump has marched expectations to the top of the hill and marched them back down again a number of times so far, but not quite in this way, not to the extent of saying, as far as he's concerned, he's going to let the war go on until maybe sometime down the line he feels it is the right time, in his judgment, to step in. And by the way, also in passing, we heard Donald Trump addressing sanctions through the issue, Katie Bowles, of the bill in the Congress from Senator Lindsey Graham, which does set out proposals for tough sanctions. This is a congressional measure. And Donald Trump said, no, it's up to me. I'll call it when the time comes, if that time comes at all. Which is, if you like, it's rather putting Congress back in its box.
It is to a degree, though. I think the one thing to bear in mind is this is Donald Trump. So we have seen different expressions depending on the day in terms of how frustrated at Russia, how positive about Ukraine. It often depends on who he has spoken to most recently. So after these conversations with the German Chancellor privately, there is a chance there is more of a positive spin on this.
Yeah.
I think on the Lindsey Graham point, it's worth pointing out that one of the topics in Washington this week is the fact that on Truth Social, Donald Trump actually spoke quite positively this week about Lindsey Graham and sanctions in a way that he hadn't previously. So while we're seeing, oh, it's up to me, says the president, another aspect of this, as we try and work out where exactly the president sits, if he himself knows, is the sense that he is speaking more positively about potentially sanctions on Russia. It's just no one is quite convinced he's going to go all the way there.
No, I mean, I'd say that's an understatement. And also, by the way, of changing tax, yesterday President Trump said when it came to China and the possibility of reaching a trade deal with China, he said it was tough to talk to and do a deal with President Xi. Today, he said they had a cordial conversation. They'd agreed to visit each other's countries, and he said they had effectively sealed a deal. So that is Donald Trump today on China. What on earth would he say tomorrow? We're going to be reflecting on that for the rest of this show and through Pienaar and Friends. It has been another extraordinary day in Washington. Katie Bowles and Nick Alipur, thank you so much for your help guiding us through that story. I'm going to bring our focus now back to our politics here in the United Kingdom. Terry Stiasny joins me now live in the studio with some interesting news, Terry, on the Reform Party.
Yes, that's right. In the last few minutes, we have just seen a tweet from Zia Yusuf, who was until now the chairman of Reform, in which he has said, 11 months ago, I became chairman of Reform. I've worked full-time as a volunteer to take the party from 14 to 30%, quadrupled its membership and delivered historic electoral results. But then he goes on to say, I no longer believe working to get a Reform government elected is a good use of my time and hereby resign the office.
Can you read between those lines? What's going on?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if the two things are directly related, but interestingly, yesterday, the newly elected MP from the by-election from Runcorn and Helsby, Sarah Pochin, asked her first question at Prime Minister's Question Time about the issue of banning the burqa. And Zia Yusuf's response to that was, nothing to do with me, had no idea about the question, nor that it wasn't policy. I do think it's dumb for a party to ask the PM if they would do something the party itself wouldn't do. So we, can't necessarily, prove that the one thing caused the other, but interesting timing, certainly.
Yeah, it is. I don't know if we can, join dots and see a pattern here. I mean, there's one pattern that we can see when it comes to, smaller parties, even if they do have something of a following out in the country. It doesn't take too many MPs to fall out among themselves, does it?
It doesn't. And it has to be said that has often happened with parties run by Nigel Farage in particular, where people have often fallen out. We've seen that with Rupert Lowe already. And, even with a small group of MPs, they seem to be, Zia Yusuf, of course, not an MP, but they do seem to have a habit of falling out with one another. Yeah. And while Reform, in other measures, apart from cordiality between leading figures, have been doing rather well in the opinion polls. Well, yes, opinion polls have been very favourable to them. Some, in some polls they've been right ahead, right at the topping the polls. And obviously the local elections as well. They had great successes. They've taken over councils, and they were hoping to do well at that. But still seems to be a bit of a problem within the party here. Okay, we will watch and we will follow this, and you'll do that, I know, with us too. Terry Stiasny, our political correspondent. Thank you so much. So look, there is a lot there, just in the space of the last hour or so, for us all to digest and to discuss, which we will do, after 6 o'clock in about 20 minutes' time here on Pienaar and Friends, when I'm going to be joined by Adam Boulton, my fellow Times Radio presenter, and by Anna Mikhailova, our new political editor here at Times Radio. And as ever, you are there with us. I'm so keen at this point to get some of your thoughts into the conversation of what we've been hearing. The remarkable scenes at the White House, I suppose, topping all of that. I mean, I found it quite surprising, even though I occasionally wonder if I'm beyond the point of being surprised by anything in politics. The answer is I'm not, because I'm constantly being surprised. Now, we can get the thoughts. Again, thank you to Terry Stiasny. Now, George Beebe joins us now, who's a former director of the CIA's Russia Analysis Unit and a former advisor on Russia matters to the then Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney. Welcome to you, George. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if you were watching those scenes in the Oval Office with us just a short while ago?
Well, I saw some of them, yes.
Okay, well, take my word for it, if you didn't see all of it, it was pretty remarkable. Much of it was something of a ramble. We have become used to that. What was included in that monologue from the president was material to which we cannot describe ourselves as being accustomed. Here's just a snatch of what we heard.
When I see the moment where it's not going to stop, and I'm sure you're going to do the same thing, will be very, very, very tough. And it could be on both countries, to be honest. It takes two to tango. But we're going to be very tough. Whether it's Russia or anybody else, we're going to be very tough. That's a bloodbath that's going on over there. And when I see the moment where I say, well, they're going to just keep fighting. I gave the analogy yesterday when I spoke to President Putin. I had a 2-hour and 15-minute call with him. Sometimes, and this is me speaking maybe in a negative sense, but sometimes you see two young children fighting like crazy. They hate each other and they're fighting in a park. And you try and pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot, because both sides are suffering, before you pull them apart, before they're able to be pulled apart. But it's a pretty known analogy. You have two kids, they fight. Sometimes you let them fight for a little while. You see it in hockey, you see it in sports. the referees, let them go for a couple of seconds, let them go for a little while before you pull them apart. And maybe, and I said it, and maybe that's a negative because we're saying go, but a lot of bad blood. There's some bad blood between the two. I have to deal with it, and the Chancellor has to deal with it. It's incredible. The level of, there's a great hatred between those two men.
That was, of course, President Trump speaking just a few moments ago. George Beebe then on the line, former director of Russia analysis at the CIA. George, what do you think of what you've just heard?
Well, I think it has significance on several levels. I think the most important level of significance is that it is a signal that Trump is going to step away from active efforts to bring about a diplomatic settlement of the war in Ukraine. He has obviously assessed that the time is not right for a deal, so he's going to take a break. And his hope is that he will be able to return to this at some future time when the prospects for a settlement look a little brighter. Now, the question that raises, of course, is what role might the United States continue to have, if any, in aiding Ukraine in this fight with Russia? Because the United States has not simply been a disinterested observer of this fight between Ukraine and Russia. We have been an active player. We have not had boots on the ground, so to speak, as President Joe Biden once put it, but we've certainly played a very active role in providing weapons, in providing advice, and in providing intelligence that has been vital to Ukraine's ability to continue to prosecute this war. So this raises an immediate question. Are we going to continue to provide that kind of aid? Yes. And I think the intelligence aid is the single most critical part of all of this. Yes. That's not something that Europe can replicate. And if we don't continue to provide that to the Ukrainians, I think Ukraine's battlefield fortunes are going to suffer quite significantly and probably quite rapidly.
Which is a very dark prospect, George, isn't it? Because as you say, it's not as if the United States and the President of the United States has no agency in this, has no power to influence events. And by saying, in terms that he intends to leave Ukraine and Russia to fight it out for a while longer, he's in effect writing a permit for Russia to carry on and intensify the attacks that we've seen lately, and maybe escalate those attacks without fear of President Trump stepping in with the kind of sanctions that might have made a difference that Friends of Ukraine were so hoping to see. And now, I suppose we'll, at least for the foreseeable future, we'll just leave to one side.
Well, I don't think he intends simply to give Russia a green light to act with impunity. He did allude in that conversation in the White House that, perhaps that could be a downside in all of this. But I'm not sure he has a very good option anymore to continue assistance to Ukraine. And the reason why is the nature of what Ukraine carried out in these operations over the weekend against Russia. There are two aspects of this that has got to be very disturbing to Trump. The first is that Ukraine went after one of the legs of Russia's nuclear triad. That, of course, poses a real danger of escalation, and it poses a real danger that the United States might get dragged into an escalatory cycle if the Russians perceive that we had any kind of a role in facilitating or green lighting those attacks on Russia's nuclear capability. And that, I think, gives Trump an enormous incentive to distance himself from those kinds of operations by cutting off intelligence aid and making absolutely clear that the United States has no involvement in any future such operation that the Ukrainians might undertake. The other part of this is the terrorist act. Yeah. Part of this, these operations included attacks on transportation infrastructure, on passenger trains, that the Russians understandably regard as acts of terrorism. And I think the United States, and Trump in particular, has another strong incentive to distance ourselves from any involvement in that kind of activity. So I think the Ukrainians, while the operation was was brilliantly conceived and very cleverly carried out, did, I believe, themselves a great disservice with the relationship with the United States, because I think they have incentivized the United States to step away not just from the peace process, but from active support to Ukraine itself.
But is it not, George, and thank you for your views on this, but is it not unarguable that were the United States, if President Trump was to take the view that I don't want to be involved in escalation or the perception of escalation, and so I might even consider, again, for a second time, withdrawing American intelligence support for Ukraine, the real effect of that on the ground would be to very significantly weaken Ukraine and very significantly strengthen Vladimir Putin. It would be an option now he could take the action that many of Ukraine's friends want, which is to exercise his power to impose strong economic sanctions on Ukraine while maintaining the level of support militarily that America is supplying now. I mean, you could argue that Russia would scarcely imagine that Donald Trump would wish to see this escalated on Ukraine's side. There's been no sign of that whatsoever. As things stand, it is Ukraine and not Russia who are going to be dismayed by what they've been hearing from the president, surely.
Well, I think that's right. I do think that the Ukrainians made an error in believing that they could pull something like this off without informing Trump and attempt to jam him toward deepening support for Ukraine and imposing tougher sanctions on Russia. My guess is that Trump is not the kind of president that takes that kind of activity very lightly. I don't think he likes to be played, and I think he probably perceives that that's exactly what Ukraine did with this operation. Now, could Trump take action on economic sanctions? I don't think that's realistic in terms of any kind of impact that would have on Russia. The bill that's right now in the U.S. Senate, sponsored by Lindsey Graham and 79 other U.S. senators, attempts to impose secondary sanctions on customers of Russia and impose quite onerous sanctions on those that are buying Russian products of various kinds. And I think that would have an enormously counterproductive effect on America's relationship with countries like India, countries like Turkey, and with China. We're engaged right now in active negotiations with China to try to sort out this trade relationship. We've made some progress with India. All of that would be swept away by the kind of sanctions bill that Lindsey Graham is sponsoring. And I doubt it would have much of a dent on Russia, actually. Russia has shown a great deal of economic resilience, a great deal of ability to overcome these sorts of sanctions. I think the United States has, over the course of the last 3+ years, greatly overestimated the degree to which economic punishment can shape Russia's decisions on what it regards as critical national security matters.
George Beebe, thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you for joining us on the show this evening. That's George Beebe, former Russia analysis director of the CIA. Going to get the thoughts in a moment here live on the programme to what we've been hearing from President Trump, from Fabrice Potier, who is a former director of policy at NATO. Now, just briefly now, let me just bring you an update on our story on British politics at Westminster. We were hearing a moment ago the chairman of Reform, Zia Youssef, has decided to stand down as chairman. Nigel Farage has now shared this on the social media platform X. He said, as I said just last week, he was a huge factor in our success on May the 1st and is an enormously talented person. Politics can be a highly pressured and difficult game, and Zia has clearly had enough. He is a loss to us and to public life. We'll be talking about that story too. We'll find time for that too in the course of the next hour on Pienaar and Friends. Now, though, back to the events in the Oval Office, the comments, the remarks, the in many ways remarkable remarks of Donald Trump, President Trump, talking about Ukraine. The president gave a glimpse into the conversation he'd had on the phone yesterday with Vladimir Putin.
You know, I gave the analogy yesterday when I spoke to President Putin. I had a 2-hour and 15-minute call with him. Sometimes, and this is me speaking maybe in a negative sense, but sometimes you see two young children fighting like crazy. They hate each other and they're fighting in a park. And you try and pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot because both sides are suffering before you pull them apart, before they're able to be pulled apart. But it's a pretty known analogy. You have two kids, they fight. Sometimes you let them fight for a little while. You see it in hockey, you see it in sports. The referees let them go for a couple of seconds, let them go for a little while before you pull them apart. And maybe, and I said it, and maybe that's a negative because we're saying go, but a lot of bad blood. There's some bad blood between the two. I have to deal with it, and the Chancellor has to deal with it. It's incredible, the level of, there's a great hatred between those two men.
So, President Trump speaking just a few moments ago. Fabrice Poitier, the former Director of Policy Planning at NATO, is on the line. Welcome to you, Fabrice.
Good evening.
What were your thoughts on what you heard there from the Oval Office?
Well, first, I think the prospect of Donald Trump being a sort of kindergarten teacher is a pretty scary one, given how he handles both himself and world affairs. But that's the world we are in. Second, obviously, what is deeply disturbing, and we saw that in his message a few days ago, is that he draws this kind of equidistance between Ukraine and Russia. He equates what Ukraine did over the weekend in terms of strikes against some of Vladimir Putin's war infrastructure. He equates that to what Russia has been doing by attacking Ukrainian civilians and cities. And obviously, this is both morally but also strategically wrong. And just to conclude here, I think the paradox is Trump is not giving himself the means to finish this. He claims he wants to finish it. He shows impatience. He's kind of right about that because this is a war that has cost in human lives and in resources huge amount on both sides, but especially on the Ukrainian side, who has not asked for anything. And yet he's not giving himself the means because he's sitting on this sanctions bill that has been drafted by Senator Lindsey Graham and that is ready to get the votes in the Senate and is unwilling to pull this trigger. So I think that's in a way what the Wall Street is saying about Donald Trump. Trump always chickens out, probably can be applied here. I think he's scared to go for it against Vladimir Putin, even though we all know that every time Donald Trump signals a change of tone, a change of posture vis-a-vis Putin, that Putin then start to give some concessions or start to be willing to play a more, I would say, sincere diplomatic negotiation. So I think the time is with him, not with President Zelensky or President Putin. It's with President Trump, but he's unwilling to define this time.
Yeah. I mean, if President Trump would be able to hear what you just said, Fabrice, I think we both know he would be absolutely furious. The use of that phrase, TACO, apparently in currency among Wall Street traders. TACO, an acronym for Trump always chickens out, is how you interpret what you've just been hearing from the president. And that statement of equidistance, if you like, on the part of the president between Russia and Ukraine. He did at one point explicitly in his remarks in the Oval Office speak about, coming down hard on both sides at some point after letting them carry on, fighting like children on a playground, coming down on both sides. Takes two to tango is what he said. Look, I'm going to come in a moment to get your thoughts on sanctions, Fabrice, but I guess there will be a worry, and we touched on this a moment ago in my previous conversation, a worry that will we see America pull back further from support for Ukraine, even to the extent of denying Ukraine that vital intelligence that America can supply after the attacks on those Russian strategic bombers?
That's hard to say, and this decision obviously belongs to Donald Trump, and this is where Ukraine is vulnerable, because there's a huge dependency towards these American ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems and platforms that allow the Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves and prosecute and plan some attacks. So that's obviously the big Achilles heel of Ukraine right now. But I think it's important that the Europeans get their act together, and that's why it's important that Chancellor Merz was in Washington, because the Europeans have to start developing some alternatives to the US systems.
Yes.
It will not be as good as the US, but at least you do have some options on the table where the Ukrainians are not left with nothing in terms of space-based sensors, in terms of intel and data fusion in order to be doing targeting against Russian platforms. Yeah. So I think it's very important that the Europeans really accelerate and scale up, because they're talking about it, but frankly, I'm engaged in some of those discussions. It's not going fast and big enough. And we have the technology. It's the question of putting the money and the sense of urgency.
And Will, what we've just heard from President Trump, the idea of just openly saying he means to stand aside now and let the war go on, will that encourage Ukraine's friends in Europe to step up to the kind of degree that you say want to see? And the choice is now pretty stark.
Yes. And the paradox is that, again, in terms of space capabilities, we do have some assets, the United Kingdom and Europe as a whole. It's the question of putting them together, developing new AI-based systems to fuse a lot of the intel that you can gather through different platforms, so that the Ukrainians have what it takes to be able to defend themselves. And actually, this is not just an act of charity. If we get this right, we will have built the backbone of what basically should be European security and defense, which has been very reliant on the United States. And I think the conclusion we draw, including in London, is that we cannot have that level of dependence anymore. So actually, it's in our self-interest to get the Ukrainians the kind of system and the kind of ISR support they need, because it will serve us down the line.
Yeah, the choices do now seem to be not just stark, but inescapable. Fabrice Patier, former Director of Planning at NATO, thank you so much. We've got a lot to talk about, haven't we, on Pienaar and Friends, and we're going to start doing that in just a minute here on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It is 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends, which tonight is Anna Mikhailova, our new political editor here at Times Radio, and Adam Boulton, my fellow Times Radio presenter. And you, I'm hoping and I'm believing that you will want to get into this conversation as quickly as possible. And I certainly want to hear what it is you have to say. Send me a text, send me a tweet. And remember, we are live streaming on YouTube on our Times Radio YouTube channel too. You can see us as well as listen to the conversation and join in. After the news with Andy Hayes.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Donald Trump has suggested he may withdraw from active efforts to reach a peace deal in Ukraine. Hosting German Chancellor Merz at the White House, he gave this analogy about the war.
Sometimes you see two young children fighting like crazy. They hate each other and they're fighting in a park. And you try and pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday.
George Beebe is a former director of Russia analysis at the CIA. He's told Times Radio the US president is changing tack.
It is a signal that Trump is going to step away from active efforts to bring about a diplomatic settlement of the war in Ukraine. He has obviously assessed that the time is not ripe for a deal, so he's going to take a break.
Meanwhile, the US Defense Secretary says Washington's allies have to be combat ready. Pete Hegseth says he thinks a commitment from NATO members to raise defence spending to 5% of GDP will happen. He's been in Brussels for meetings with fellow ministers of the military alliance. Former head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, has told Times Radio, we are living in dangerous times.
I think we're facing an undeclared war from Russia already. And I think we will continue to find ourselves in confrontation with Russia, and that will be expressed by the Russians through acts of sabotage, through interference in our internal affairs, through trying to undermine our social fabric.
Zia Yusuf has resigned as chairman of Reform UK. He says on X, "I no longer believe working to get a Reform government elected is a good use of my time and hereby resign the office." He's been chairman for 11 months. Leader Nigel Farage says he's genuinely sorry that Mr Yusuf has decided to stand down. 2 teenagers have been sentenced for the manslaughter of an 80-year-old man in Leicester. Bim Coley was racially abused, beaten and kicked in Franklin Park in Braunstone Town last September and died in hospital. A 15-year-old boy will serve 7 years in custody, while a 13-year-old girl's been given a 3-year youth rehabilitation order. Mr Coley's daughter Susan says she can't understand why the attack happened.
Children of that age attacking an old age pensioner. You can see from his physique that he's a very gentle, frail man. What was going through their heads?
And the Birmingham bin strikes could last until December after almost 400 workers voted to extend their walkout. Action began in January in a row over jobs, pay and conditions. The Unite Union says wage cuts of up to £8,000 have left some staff unable to pay bills, rent and mortgages. Last month, ministers said a significantly improved offer had been made. And for news when you want it, subscribe to our podcast, The Times News Briefing and The World in 10.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app and via your smart speaker, this is Times Radio.
It is really good to have you with us here on Pienaar and Friends. It is always good to have you with us, but this is a night when the conversation should be pretty absorbing, and we are in very good company. Which tonight is Adam Boulton, my fellow Times Radio presenter. Great to see you, Adam.
Hello.
And let me, with a small pause for trumpets, fanfares and applause, say a big, big welcome to Anna Mikhailova, who has now been announced as Times Radio's new political editor. Anna, welcome.
Thank you, John. Delighted to be here.
Welcome many times over. And you can see us all on our YouTube channel, now live as before. So, you know, if you want to do it that way, watch us as well as listening. But either way, join in. Send me your thoughts. Send me a text, 87222. Start with the word Times. Or tweet to @Times Radio. Or if you want to send us a voice note, there's WhatsApp, 0333 003 2353. Start with you, Anna. Can I get your thought for the day?
Well, my thought for the day has definitely changed in the last 20 minutes. With this extraordinary news from Zia Yusuf, the Reform Party chairman, that he is standing down. And he tweeted the news as everything now comes out via Twitter. And he said, sort of crowning his period of infighting and extraordinary spats with his 4 and 5 MPs, saying that, you know, it's just not worth any of my time anymore. So obviously very humble and extremely diplomatic, but quite extraordinary and very fast moving. Yeah.
And Tim Montgomery, our fellow friend on the show, is going to be joining us in a moment to give us his take as a supporter of reform, with usually more than just a shred of knowledge of what's going on inside. But before that, Adam, what's your thought for the day?
My thought for the day is you don't have time for me, really. There's so much news happening. As we just heard from Anna, the ructions in Reform UK. We've had the German leader and Donald Trump talking about D-Day, amongst other things. And we're just hearing that the Russian ambassador is saying Britain was involved in the spider's web attack by Ukraine on planes. So much to talk about, really. And that's quite apart from whatever Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have been saying today about tax cuts, or indeed what Mel Strider's been saying, kind of apologising for Liz Truss.
Yeah, kind of. So let us get on with it and say big welcome to Tim Montgomery, political commentator and, of course, a member of Reform. I'm told he's not quite ready there. Maybe he's just thinking through what's going to be what is in his mind. Before we move on to the question of President Trump and Ukraine and all of that, because that was a very significant event. I mean, we use that phrase and it's easy to overuse it when you're talking about Donald Trump and his latest pronouncements. It was, in effect, setting out in words of one syllable what is a new approach to Ukraine, or if you like, saying the quiet bit out loud, articulating what has been going on already for a while. An explanation, if you like, or at least an attempt at an explanation, or something resembling an explanation of his refusal to get involved in putting pressure on Vladimir Putin. Look, I mean, let's get your thoughts on that, guys. I mean, I watched that. I watched, maybe wondering, was there going to be a dust-up between President Trump and Friedrich Merz? There was not. Friedrich Merz went in there, clearly having schooled himself on the way to deal with this, maybe by saying as little as possible. And what little he did say was laced with compliments with Donald Trump. And he didn't even really rise to the provocation when there was every ground to be provoked. But he didn't need to do anything at all for Donald Trump to grab the spotlight, which he loves to do, and now again the headlines and the attentions of the world, Adam, with telling us how he means to deal with Ukraine and the Ukraine war now.
Yeah, I mean, describing the two of them as boys fighting, and sometimes you have to let them get on with it. I think this is a sign, really, that Donald Trump knows that his initiatives are getting nowhere. He's made it clear since his phone call yesterday that he doesn't want to put pressure on or in any way criticize Vladimir Putin. He sees him as a fellow person. And I think, what is fascinating is that Friedrich Merz, who we don't really know at the moment, he's the new German Chancellor, but I think he's going to be a big player. I mean, Germany is a big player anyway, but he clearly is coming in very determined. He made it quite clear from the beginning that he felt Germany had to do more in its own defence and more to support Ukraine. And he handled, Trump pretty deftly. I mean, you were just telling me earlier on, that Trump even raised D-Day, but rather than saying, it was a great Allied victory, he sort of almost commiserated with the German Chancellor about it, but the German Chancellor was having none with it, saying, look, this was our liberation. So I think that, Trump has got what he wanted, which is another TV special with another leader. But I think the message that you're really getting from the Germans, and you're getting increasingly from other leaders, is, okay, you do your thing and we'll actually get on with what matters.
Yeah, if there was ever any serious doubt that Ukraine's allies, other than America, are going to have to step up and fill the void, there is no such doubt now. And you sort of get the sense, don't you, Anna, that the leaders of the nations supporting Ukraine pretty much knew that perfectly well. It's not that they were in denial about Donald Trump's refusal to engage and take on Vladimir Putin. They just didn't want to say it out loud that they'd given up hope.
Indeed, and Merz has responded since the meeting by essentially flattering Donald Trump by saying that he remains the key person in the world that could do something and put pressure on Russia. But there is this dividing line now where he effectively admits that while both sides say they want the war to end, the route to that is quite obviously very different. And Donald Trump just saying that, you just got to, sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while, is quite the shift in approach from him previously talking a lot about stopping the casualties, whereas now he's essentially moved back to the realpolitik view of this, which is it's a sphere of influence, it's Russia's sphere of influence, and therefore I'm just going to let them get on with it.
And if there had been any inhibition on Vladimir Putin, maybe to sort of think about the scale of, and now there will be retaliation after the attack, the drone attack on those Russian strategic bombers a few days ago. If there had been any inhibition, if I go too far, maybe I'll tip President Trump to the point of taking action against me and breaking the sort of burgeoning relationship. It won't be there now. He will feel certainly more empowered to take the kind of action that he would wish to take. I'm going to pick up on some of that in just a moment. We do walk and chew gum on this show at the same time. I'm going to revert now to the story of reform in our own politics, and who better to get a thought on that from than Tim Montgomery. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
So, the chairman of the party has walked.
Yep.
What on earth is going on?
Well, first of all, I'd say on a personal level, I'm pretty devastated. I think this is a huge moment and a very regrettable one for Reform. I didn't know Zia Yusuf when I joined Reform. I've got to know him very well. I think he was absolutely essential to what Reform were doing in terms of modernisation. The success and the professionalisation of Reform has owed an awful lot to him. And I don't fully know what's happened in the last 24 hours, but I know he was very upset about the burqa question that was asked by the new Reform MP for Runcorn. I think he has experienced quite a lot of personal nastiness on social media and that over the time because of it. He's a Muslim, and I wonder whether that got to him. a little bit. He's not been an angel. He's a man in a hurry. And I think he's upset a lot of people in reform by some of the professionalisation and some of the internal reforms that he's made. And I'm sure he hasn't always carried out those well. But he was, I think, essential to trying to turn reform into a professional organisation. And he leaves a very big hole. And I've seen Nigel Farage's tweet, and I know Nigel means it. Nigel did not want this. Nigel is very upset by it. This was someone he had picked to be absolutely central to his plans for reform. And Zia has now gone, and I suspect there's no return from it.
Yeah.
And I think since the reform surge in the polls that we've all been following and astounded by, this is a massive, massive setback. And on a personal level, I just put my heart out to Zia, because this is something he's committed a lot of time to, and he won't have walked away from it lightly.
But let's make it clear, this is not a usual political resignation where you leave and you say, I thank the party and I express my good wishes for the future. Just reading his resignation statement, he actually says, I no longer believe working to get a reform government elected is a good use of my time, and I hereby resign. So it's not just resigning, it's falling out of love with the party. Now remember, he is someone who described Sarah Pochin's question at Prime Minister's questions yesterday, which we understand had been discussed in advance, the question about banning the burqa. He described that as dumb. And I think, reading between the lines, Tim, one has to conclude, and you mentioned social media, that his experience of reform supporters over the past 24 hours is, frankly, that they don't see a place for Muslims in supporting reform.
I wouldn't go quite as far as that. I think it's certainly his experience of social media. It's often difficult to disentangle who are reform supporters and who are not. But there is certainly, any woman knows there's an awful lot of misogyny on social media. Any Muslim knows there's a lot of hatred towards Muslims. And I think he has certainly experienced a lot of that. And Adam, I certainly wouldn't pretend that none of it has come from reform members. And in his vetting of candidates, which is a hugely successful part of reform success in the local elections, he was getting rid of some of the nastier elements that have been in reform that got in. He has had a zero tolerance approach to that, fully backed by Nigel Farage. That must now continue. There must be no retreat from that. But yeah, I'm sure he was affected by that. And there are, I'm afraid, in populist movements all over the world, there are some nasty elements. But he was getting rid of them with Nigel Farage's blessing, and that work must continue.
He's also not the first person of South Asian origin who's been sidelined, is he?
Who else are you thinking of?
I cannot think of the name for the moment, but the gentleman who was deputy leader of the
the Ben Habib.
Yeah, Ben Habib.
Well, I think that fallout was a different matter altogether. What I think you can say is that Nigel Farage will bring on talent, whatever the skin colour or religion, when he sees it.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to wonder, what is this going to do to the credibility of the party? I don't mean as its footprint in British politics. It's still got a large footprint in the opinion polls. We're going to talk later on to Luke Trill from More in Common, who can give us the latest on that. There may be a little bit of a slippage in that, but they're still pretty well supported. And we have here Richard Tice, deputy leader, who's posted, I wish to add my huge thanks to Zia for his hard work and major help in securing progress and success over 11 months. We would not be where we are today without him. So clearly an attempt by the upper level of the party to sort of gloss over this and make it seem as if a little local difficulty, let's move on without success. You've got Rupert Lowe there, who's now outside the tent, and he has this to say: Zia Youssef gone. The question is, how did a man with no political experience be given such vast power within reform, a deeply unpleasant individual who at every stage was protected and promoted by Farage? So there is Rupert Lowe outside the tent, whistling in, and I use whistling as opposed to the actual accurate quote. I mean, we're seeing reform now, having gained in support, their credibility as a political force has not remotely kept force with that advance, has it?
Well, reform is advancing at a rate. I've been a reform member now for about 6 months, and the giddy rise of reform has been one of the most extraordinary phenomena I've seen in politics. Now, the question has always been, is it built on sand or is it built on rock? And the person who I felt was most able that I have come across in reform to build something that could last was Zia Youssef.
Right, well, then this is
and he's gone.
Yeah.
And so I'm not diminishing what has happened tonight in any way. I can understand it. I think Zia Yusuf had enough on a personal level. I don't think Sarah Ponchin's question yesterday was incidental. I think that may have been a trigger, but it was more like the straw that probably broke the camel's back.
You say it was discussed beforehand, by the way. That was Sarah Ponchin, the new MP, putting a question across the floor to the Prime Minister, effectively saying, let's ban the burqa. And the point was, well, that is not party policy. No. It is. But you said there were discussions beforehand. What?
No, I didn't say that. I think that was Adam who said that.
It is being reported that it was known that she was going to get a question and that there had been discussions.
I can confirm personally that it was. I was briefed about it beforehand, so we knew it was coming.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay, and look,
but it's fascinating that Zia did not know, or says he does not know. Right. So he's kept out of the tent there.
Good point to mention that Nigel Farage, leader of the party, is going to be speaking to Rod Liddle on Times Radio on Saturday from 10 o'clock. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends with Adam Boulton, Anna Mikhailova. Tim Montgomery's popped in, put useful intel on reform. We're going to talk to Luke Trill about the polls a little bit later on, and we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk more, aren't we, about what we all heard in the Oval Office just a short while ago. The words from Donald Trump that would have sent chills down spines in Ukraine and among the friends of Ukraine. This is Pienaar and Friends at 6:18 on Times Radio.
Or Google Play today. John Pienaar on Times Radio.
Now, look, if you normally listen to us on Times Radio at home, why not have a listen in the car? If you've got a DAB radio in your car, just need to search the dial for Times Radio. And if you can't find it, you may need to rescan the radio. It doesn't take long, usually works. And if you have to, there are more instructions for you on the Times Radio website. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends here on Times Radio. Anna Mikhailova, our brand new political editor, is here. I'm very happy to say Adam Boulton, not brand new, but very welcome presenter. And we've got Luke Trill joined us from More in Common, the Pollster. Great to see you, Luke.
Great to see you.
So let's go back to what happened in the Oval Office and all that meant, and against the background of what's been happening in Brussels with NATO leaders discussing the defence of Europe against Russia, talks yesterday in Brussels about support for Ukraine, and what the public make of all of this. Tell me about the British public's attitudes to the war in Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, so we asked this week with the Defence Review coming out, who is the biggest threat to the UK? Listed a whole series of countries, and the runaway winner was Russia. In fact, 48% said Russia. The next closest was on 14%. That was people who said Islamic terrorism. And the United States was actually next on 5%.
5%.
On 5%. So it was way down. And then
That's
other countries.
The number of people who believe Elvis is still
exactly. So I wouldn't pay too much into that. But it just shows how, in the public's mind, Russia really has become sort of enemy number one. Yeah. And we know as well that the British public, unlike the public in particularly the United States, are not very divided on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Britons overwhelmingly think we should be backing Ukraine, and crucially think that it's important to the UK that Ukraine is able to defend its sovereignty.
So what sort of numbers are we talking about? When we say the most Brits in the survey support, Ukraine, see Russia as a threat and are ready to take or want to see strong action taken in favour of Ukraine and to keep Russia at bay. What sort of numbers are we talking about?
It's been quite stable, actually, since the start of the conflict, around 7 in 10.
Saying that's a strong number.
It is a big number, and it's interesting. Even, we know that Reform UK's leadership is a little bit more sceptical about Ukraine. Even Reform voters are more likely to say it matters to the UK than not that Ukraine defends its sovereignty.
Right.
And when you ask about that question of sending troops on the ground to police any deal, we actually did polling across a number of European countries, and again, it was the UK was the country where there was the strongest support for doing that.
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that's partly a product of the main, Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats, all being agreed on this one?
Yeah, I think particularly Boris Johnson being leader at the time and making it such a big part of his premiership, because what's tended to happen in other countries is it's voters on the right who have kind of split off and been less supportive of Ukraine, again, particularly in the US, but also some countries on the continent as well. Here we haven't had that as much, and I think that cross-party consensus trickles down.
How does that then translate into support for spending more on defence? Very much the subject on the table, today in Brussels, even more so in a week or so at The Hague, and maybe more so yet when you look at Donald Trump today, talking about just letting them fight it out in Ukraine or standing back from backing up Ukraine more.
Well, it's pretty extraordinary. We also asked in the run-up to the defence review over the weekend, we asked, do you think that the UK, if it were invaded, would be able to defend itself? Are we ready to defend ourselves? And 65% of the public said they didn't think that the UK would be ready. Just 19% thought that they would. When we asked about fighting overseas, it was even worse. 71% said we couldn't fight a war overseas. Just 14% said that we could. So in that context, actually, when you ask the public about defence spending uplifts, they are quite positive about it. They tend to say it's the right thing. But, and here is the crucial caveat, when you ask, would you be prepared to see your taxes go up to pay for more defence spending, the public say no to that. They were quite happy with that shift from aid to defence spending. That made sense to people. But the uplift from 2.5 to 3, much harder.
We are so cake and easy, aren't we?
Well, and I think that draws an interesting comparison to what's happened in the United States, where public opinion is actually quite different on the Ukraine question. And I wonder how much of that is because the MAGA movement, all that Donald Trump supporters made a really big deal of linking household finances and inflation to Ukraine and aid, and that obviously trickled down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know, when I've been coming on the show over the past year, the top issue has not changed for people. It is the cost of living.
Yeah.
It is everything is too expensive. And if you pit, basically anything against that, maybe apart from the NHS, people go, no, we need to be tackling the cost of living. So although the UK hasn't experienced that same Ukraine fatigue we've seen in other countries, whether the appetite for diverting more public funding to Ukraine would be there in the long term, it's difficult to see in the face of that.
And just to push home the sort of, the cake and eat it point, are we in the business of cake and yet more cake and still yet more cake, and they're just eating all of it? When people say they want to see us being ready to defend ourselves more. I mean, to say that we're not ready to defend ourselves clearly implies we ought to be better able to do that. But does that also go along with the idea that we also want to see much more spent on the NHS and on policing and on local government? And the list goes on, while we're saying, don't tax us more, please.
Yeah, and in fact, when we ask where should the government find cuts, it's hard to get the public to come up with sort of tangible policy areas. What the public tend to say when you say, well, look, is it really true? Do we need tax rises or do we need spending cuts? They say, well, no, there's waste to cut. And this is, it's in part because politicians have talked about waste for so long. In fact, we asked the public, how much of government spending do you think could be cut without having an impact on services or the economy? And 44% of the public thought that figure was more than 20%. They thought you could take 20% out of government spending.
44%.
44% thought it was more than 20. It was half thought it was more than 15%. I mean, extraordinary. Like, the public really think there's a lot of fat. Another question we asked was around how much do you think goes on MPs' pay? And the public thought that about as much went on MPs' pay as goes on the health service. So, it's not like the public have a great grasp of the figures involved.
No, about as tenuous as it gets.
It does seem to me, though, that correct me if I'm wrong, that even although the answers are obvious, people don't want taxes to go up, they don't want cuts in public services, that certainly on defence, there is more of an argument. People are opening up in that respect, which, may be all that courageous politicians need.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that when we talk about it in focus groups, it's actually a bit similar to arguments on climate. If you just talk about defence, it's quite difficult. But if you talk about defence jobs, that actually this is putting back, it's not just spending the money on arms, it's going to create jobs in places, like Barrow and places like that, then you get people on board with it as well. I think the difficulty is, though, actually is partly the government's fault. I think in public opinion terms, you could probably have gotten away with reversing the Sunak NI cuts, actually, in the run-up to last year, and ruling that out. They've boxed them in, so they can only make cuts which affect quite targeted groups, for instance, winter fuel allowance, and we know how unpopular that was.
Yeah, I'm going to go to the news shortly, guys, but before we do, we're sort of, juggling more than one plate. You don't juggle plates, you spin plates, you juggle balls. But so let's spin a different plate now and go back to the Reform Party. In politics here in the United Kingdom. Not that Ukraine and the defence of the West is not our politics, but just on a different level, a different scale. Luke, what do you reckon what we've been hearing about the resignation of the chairman of the Reform Party, not just resigning, but saying he effectively sees no point in giving it any support anymore, and Tim says that's a loss to the party? You've certainly got a picture. It's going to make headlines of turmoil. What's it going to mean for the party's popularity? I know you can't know that, but I just wonder what you think.
Well, it was interesting. So when Rupert Lowe was expelled from the party, we asked people, how much have you heard about this? And it was only around 3 in 10 who said that they had heard more than a little bit about it. So I'm not sure it will get big cut through, but I think the danger is Reform is in that stage where it's trying to pass the credibility test. It's got that group who support Reform because they're ideologues, they like Nigel Farage. It's now trying to appeal to a much larger group of people, and I just think that things like this, if it becomes a vibe that they're fighting each other, it's less the specifics, risks stalling their momentum as people go, well, God, we got rid of the Tories because we were fed up of them going from one to the other and the fighting. Do we really want that? And I think it probably leans into that Keir Starmer safe pair of hands argument.
Yeah, I'm now looking at the latest polling, for the parties. I probably shouldn't read too much into this, but there's been a slight drop in Reform's support. Is that significant? We are only talking about a couple of points.
It looks like that since the local elections, they had that big rise in support. It looks like their momentum has stalled a little bit, and not just across us, but other pollsters as well. We've seen them dip back a little bit.
But interesting, looking at your poll, you found that women are much more likely to stick with the Tories than men.
Yeah, women are propping the Tories up at the moment. The Tories are doing 7 points better with women than they are with men. Men much more likely to go for Reform UK.
All right, Luke, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for for shining a light on this stuff the way that you do so helpfully each week. Now, we're going to go back to the story of Ukraine after the news. We're going to be joined by Alexander Kara. He's a former Ukrainian defence minister, and also by a member of parliament from the German Bundestag, Tobias Winkler. So a lot to talk about, and we really want to hear what you're thinking. As I say, send us a text, send us a tweet, do join in, and let's keep talking after the news here on Times Radio with Andy Hayes.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Zia Youssef has resigned as chairman of Reform UK. He says on X he no longer believes that trying to get the party elected is a good use of his time. He's been chairman for 11 months. Leader Nigel Farage says he's genuinely sorry he's decided to stand down. Political commentator and Reform supporter Tim Montgomery has given his reaction to Times Radio.
I'm pretty devastated. I think this is a huge moment and a very regrettable one for Reform. I didn't know Zia Youssef when I joined Reform. I've got to know him very well. I think he was absolutely essential to what Reform were doing in terms of modernisation. The success and the professionalisation of Reform has owed an awful lot to him. I know he was very upset about the burqa question that was asked by the new Reform MP for Runcorn.
Donald Trump has described Russia and Ukraine as two children who hate each other fighting in a park. The US president said that sometimes it's best to let them get on with it. It appears to be a signal he's withdrawing from active efforts to find a peace deal. He spoke to Vladimir Putin yesterday. The 15-year-old boy has been jailed for 7 years for killing an 80-year-old man in Leicestershire last September. A girl aged 13 has been given a 3-year youth rehabilitation order. Both were convicted of manslaughter after the attack on Bim Coley as he walked his dog in Franklin Park in Braunstone Town. And Times Radio has announced that 2 new presenters are joining the station, taking on regular hosting duties on The Times at 1. Joe Coburn and Stephen Sacker will make their first appearances on Times Radio later this month. And don't forget, you can set the Times News Briefing as your news service on Alexa.
This is Times Radio.
With daily news podcast from The Times. Listen in the Times Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts. Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
I'm John Pienaar here with Pienaar and Friends. Tonight, that is Anna Mikhailova, our new political editor at Times Radio, Adam Boulton, my fellow presenter, and my other fellow presenter, Kate Borsay, who takes over at 7.
Hiya, John. 2 big stories that we're covering, as I know you have been as well, but we'll extend the conversation and dig more into some of the main talking points. Donald Trump, with those first face-to-face talks with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, notable because all the lines, all the stories don't concern Merz at all, really, unless it's the similarity on support for Ukraine. That is Donald Trump talking about Russia and Ukraine as 2 children, like 2 children fighting in a park. We'll dig into some of his comments. Also, he's sort of come out and confirmed what everyone assumed was going on with Elon Musk, the issues over EVs, Elon Musk's issue with the big beautiful bill that he thinks is anything but big and beautiful in terms of spending commitments. So we'll dig plenty into that. We'll go to Washington. We'll speak to Niall Stanage, associate editor at The Hill, about that. So we'll get up to date on that. And of course, the resignation of Zia Youssef as well, the Reform UK chairman who's quit. We'll be speaking to Ben Habib, who's the former deputy leader for the party and certainly no fan of Zia Youssef. And obviously it will be one perspective, and it's, you know, open of us to say that Habib is not a fan. But we'll dig into what we know of Youssef so far, Habib's experiences with him. There were some allegations, of course, made by Zia Youssef against Rupert Lowe, the Reform MP who got kicked out of the party, and Rupert Lowe's written a statement on Twitter saying, you know, why did Habib make these false allegations about me? Why was he supported by the likes of Nigel Farage? And these are questions that we can ask again. I don't think anyone, you know, knows whether it was a particular incident or a long-running end of his tether decision that Zia Youssef came to today. But there was certainly already a lot of discerning comments within the party, you know, and from the likes of Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe about the fact that Zia Youssef had no political experience, and that was something that they didn't agree to when it came to the constitution of the party and what Youssef was there to represent. So look, we'll talk plenty about that as well. Our big guest coming up after 9:30, I should mention her. It's Candace Rondo. She's gosh, she's so intelligent. She's this fascinating American who spent a gap year in St. Petersburg at exactly the time that Vladimir Putin and Yevgeny Prigozhin were forming a friendship. And she's written a new book. It's called Putin's Sledgehammer, and it gives the account of Prigozhin becoming leader of the Wagner Group and what happened in the run-up to him falling out with Vladimir Putin. And it sort of gives you a guide on how not to topple Vladimir Putin. And she's got some really interesting insight from her many interviews and much research that she's done for the book. She's got some really interesting insight into Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. It's just one of those fascinating listens, John, that our listeners, I know, will really enjoy.
Okay, loads coming up with you, Kate, after 7, right after Pienaar and Friends. So look, let us then reflect on what we heard just within the last hour or so in the Oval Office. I mean, you are doing that and sharing your thoughts. Thank you for that, as always. Simon, thank you for writing in. Simon says, when you see one kid assaulting another in the playground, that was Donald Trump's analogy. That was his reason for not intervening. He said, you don't let them fight, you punish the attacker. And another one of you has written in, Chancellor Merz was very good in using his small speaking part to get European points across. Good on him. Well, he was sparing in his comments and interventions, but he did at the very end of all of that make it pretty clear that what Donald Trump was saying was not what he thought was needed at all. And Amanda writes in, if that ramble doesn't show that Trump is on Putin's side, I don't know what can. Well, let's just listen back, just reflect on some of it. The Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, was there in the Oval Office. It wasn't a fight between him and Donald Trump. It was just something in many ways equally remarkable. It started off cordially enough.
It's an honor to have you. As you know, the Chancellor just won a great election, very, very strong election. Very respected man. I can tell you, we've been on the phone many times talking about some of the problems of the world outside of Germany. And it's very sad what's going on. We both feel that way. What's going on with Russia, Ukraine, and other things we talk about, but Russia, Ukraine in particular. I'd like to see it end, and maybe it'll end, but we get some news, there'll be some fighting. Something happened a couple of days ago, and now they do a return, and, here it goes. It's not good. He's unhappy about it. I'm unhappy about it.
And neither leader then going out of their way to fall out, which is something we wasn't quite that way with previous leaders, goodness knows. There was a bit of an awkward moment when he was asked whether Germany was spending enough on defence.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't discussed it very much. I know that you're spending more money on defence now, and quite a bit more money, and that's a positive thing. I'm not sure that General MacArthur would have said it's positive, He wouldn't like it, but I sort of think it's good. You understand what I mean by that?
Absolutely, I understand.
He made a statement, never let Germany rearm. And I said, I always think about that when he says, sir, we're spending more money on defense. I say, oh, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a good thing. But, at least to a certain point. There'll be a point when I'll say, please don't arm anymore if you don't mind. We'll be watching him. I'll get it.
Yes, well, President Trump did have that insight. And then came this on Ukraine.
I gave the analogy yesterday when I spoke to President Putin. I had a 2-hour and 15-minute call with him. Sometimes, and this is me speaking maybe in a negative sense, but sometimes you see two young children fighting like crazy. They hate each other and they're fighting in a park. And you try and pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot because both sides are suffering before you pull them apart, before they're able to be pulled apart. But it's a pretty known analogy. You have two kids, they fight. Sometimes you let them fight for a little while. You see it in hockey. You see it in sports. The referees let them go for a couple of seconds, let them go for a little while before you pull them apart. And maybe, and I said it, and maybe that's a negative because we're saying go, but a lot of bad blood. There's some bad blood between the two. I have to deal with it, and the Chancellor has to deal with it. It's incredible. The level of, there's a great hatred between those two men.
And yes, President Trump did in fact say that. He did say to President Putin in a long telephone call, well, maybe Vladimir. He does, as far as we can see, address the Russian president by his first name in these conversations. Maybe, Vladimir, I'm just going to watch you carry on waging war until in Ukraine, after your invasion of Ukraine, until I deem the time is right for me to step in. And when I do step in, maybe it'll be against you and against you.
I mean, it was worse than that, wasn't it? I mean, it was rambling, talking absolute rubbish. And you know, if you break it down, in the course of that, you have the President of the United States sympathising with the President of Russia who launched this war, saying that he's unhappy, and then saying that he agreed with the President of Russia that maybe he ought to fight a bit more. I mean, it is grossly offensive, frankly.
Yeah, it was chilling. We can get the thoughts now directly from Tobias Winkler, who's a member of the CSU party in the Bundestag in Germany. Tobias, welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, having me on the show. Thank you.
You're very
John.
welcome. Just share your thoughts on what we heard in the Oval Office.
So this visit was very closely followed by the German public, of course, because it could be also a critical moment. I think we are deliberated that it worked quite well with the atmosphere. We remember Zelensky's visit to White House. And I think Friedrich Merz, he had the right mix between being a partner which Donald Trump named not an easy one, but someone he likes to talk to. And this is something I think we could achieve. And you always have to have in mind then if Friedrich Merz goes to the White House, it's not only the German Chancellor, it's also a representative of the European Union and also of the coalition of the willing.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Tobias, the German Chancellor was not ambushed. He was not battered in the way that we saw certainly the leader of Ukraine and more recently the leader of South Africa battered in what was clearly a pre-planned ambush. That did not happen. And there will be, I suppose, some relief on the part of the Chancellor and his team and those around him at that. But what did happen, that was what caught our attention so strongly. And to hear the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief of the most powerful military force in NATO, talking about letting Ukraine and Russia, talking about them on equal terms, carry on fighting, allowing, even encouraging implicitly Putin to carry on doing what he's about to do, to go on doing. What did you make of that?
So this analogy of some young boys fighting, or like in hockey or ice hockey, this is wrong in so many aspects. And this is really a little bit disappointing that he used this picture for describing the conflict. So it was a one-sided party or a one-sided attack from Russia towards Ukraine. This is totally different from what this analogy wants to frame a picture. So, but of course, if you're a Chancellor of Germany and you're in the room that moment, I think it's not easy to correct the President of the United States. But as we know from Donald Trump, from his what he did in the last 3 months, that this can change immediately. So therefore, I'm optimistic that this will not be the analogy or the picture he will use for a longer time.
Well, I guess you can, and maybe a lot of people can hope that. Here with me, Adam Boulton, and our political editor, Anna Mikhailova. Anna.
Well, I just think even if, as you say, it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to stick and that position might change from Donald Trump, it really undermines what the Ukraine, what Ukraine's argument is about actually just saying, pushing for the 30-day ceasefire and being able to say that is an American-backed proposal that's been hugely powerful in framing it to show that it's Russia that's the problem here and it's Russia that refuses to agree to the ceasefire. So Donald Trump saying these things is not only, as Adam said, insulting to all those people who've been fighting, who've been invaded for more than 3 years now, but the fact that it actually just undermines Ukraine's actual position in trying to get somewhere in these peace talks.
We also ought to bear in mind that Trump's done exactly the same thing on the Israel-Gaza situation. The United Nations last night voting against a call for an immediate ceasefire. with Britain, France, China, Russia on the other side. I mean, what we are seeing is, frankly, the complete failure of Donald Trump's foreign policy and proof that he is not the big guy that he claims to be.
Yeah. Well, good thought. So, last word from you, Tobias.
I couldn't agree more. So his foreign policy, he thinks in deals, and this is nothing. It's not a category of foreign policy, especially in war or conflicts like you mentioned, Middle East, Gaza, and also the invasion to Ukraine, full scale invasion, which has so many victims and people coming to death, and then using these kind of analogies, I really don't like that, but I'm optimistic that he will concentrate more. So in our picture from the other side of the Atlantic, foreign policy is the main issue, but I see Donald Trump is much more concentrated on national politics, and I hope that he will find some engagement there, or that he will leave it to the experts to come back to the diplomatic power United States has, and to the influence. They have to be at the table when we negotiate the peace or a possible peace in Ukraine, also in the Middle East, but not without the parties involved, not without Ukraine, not without the others. So therefore, I'm optimistic. This is that it's not his last word, and it's not a total change of position. He is interested in domestic politics, making jobs, creating jobs, making America great again. And this is not in foreign policies.
I mean, just briefly and lastly, Tobias, why do you tell us again and again now that you are optimistic about President Trump coming round to the side of wanting to put pressure on Vladimir Putin, along with Germany and others? There's been no sign of that.
No, I don't think so. So he has not. You can influence him. This is someone said he usually repeats the sentences or the words from the last person he met. So therefore, I'm optimistic because it's not an ideology behind. So it's just to keep the US out a little bit, and therefore, I think when he sees that he can be on the side of the winners, then he will immediately join there. Okay. So this is my optimistic view. Maybe I have to be optimistic, but I am. I will be next week in Washington, and then maybe you can have a call afterwards. Maybe then my optimism has gone.
Well, Tobias, consider yourself invited. We hear what you say, your kind invitation to invite you, and we will. Tobias Winkler there of the CSU in the Bundestag. Now, in a moment, we're going to be joined by Alexander Kara. He's a former Ukrainian defence minister here on Pienaar and Friends. This is Times Radio.
At Viking, we believe wraps up the weekend's news and takes a look at the week ahead, Saturday and Sunday from 10 p.m.
John Pienaar on Times Radio.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, Adam Boulton, Anna Mikhailova, and we're joined now by Alexander Kara, who's a former minister in the Ukrainian Defence Ministry. Welcome to the programme, Alexander.
Hello, John, and thank you for my promotion. I used to be an advisor to the minister.
An advisor.
But thank you anyway.
Well, you're very, very welcome. I'm sure you'd have been a fine minister had that opportunity come your way. What did you make, Alexander, of what you heard in the White House? I mean, many of us here were pretty stunned.
Well, first of all, I believe Europe and Taiwan have received yet another warning of what to expect from the United States if there is an event of serious crisis. And I believe it's a really serious signal from Washington. We've seen that Trump did make himself to comment on Ukraine's successful attack of the Russian so-called docked aircrafts. And actually, the very aircraft that Russians has been using since the reinvasion relentlessly in bombing Ukrainian cities. But what Trump said, I believe, it just like his choice of words showed it over simplistic worldview and how to approach an actor like Mr. Putin and Russia, and how the Americans see their role in the world.
Yes.
Actually, Trump just pulled back from this negotiation effort, and he allowed Putin to bomb Ukrainian cities with no consequences. Because besides the angry tweets, he didn't go to to green light the package or the draft of the bill that Lindsey Graham is advocating, imposing the serious sanctions on Russia. So he's just encouraging Putin to carry on this war.
Yes, I mean the Kira Rudik, who I'm sure you know, who's the Ukrainian MP, who's the leader of the Holos party in Kyiv, has tweeted, put this on social media. Is it correct to conclude President Trump silently agreed to Russia's coming unprecedented massive strike on Ukraine? And I guess that will be the essence of the fear in Kyiv.
Well, to some extent. First of all, Russia does not need any reason to retaliate, because actually they started unprovoked war back in 2014 and then reinvaded Ukraine in 2022. And they've been using all tools available against us, short of the nuclear arms. So we don't think that it's going to be something terrific. For sure, they will try to use more drones and missiles than we experienced just a couple of weeks ago, where there was almost 1,000 drones and missiles rained down on Ukrainian cities. And I believe they will carefully choose the targets, and most importantly, the civilian targets, to break our will to resist. But in general, Ukrainians do not believe that there was a slim chance of a ceasefire, let alone of peace with Russia, and we are prepared to carry on this fight.
Okay, I mean, do stay with us, Alexander. I mean, meanwhile, the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom has weighed in with some strong words, in this case directed also at the United Kingdom, and Anna Mikhailova has some of the details.
Yes, so the Russian ambassador has given an interview tonight making some extraordinary claims, saying that the recent coordinated drone attacks had involvement from London. The claim appears to be based on no evidence. He says that the fact that they believe this technology only exists in London and Washington, and because he says Donald Trump has denied American involvement and London hasn't denied it, therefore he's essentially jumping straight to the conclusion that London had something to do with it. I mean, it is pretty extraordinary to hear that.
Alexander Kara, I mean, what can one say about that? As Anna says, it seems a pretty flimsily based accusation of British involvement in that drone attack.
Well, there is a historical quote that a diplomat is an honest man sent to other country to lie on behalf of his country. And in case of Russia, not just contemporary Russia, but the Soviet Union and Russian Empire, it was the case almost each and every time. So this is part of their propaganda. It's a part to portray this conflict as a NATO-provoked conflict against Russia. And certainly there is no evidence. And actually, if in the beginning of the war, when the Americans decided to provide us with some capabilities, they might have said that, and address Americans, to restrain Ukraine's actions. But now with Americans, just as a bystander watching what's going on, they just refocused attention to the United Kingdom. It's just a part of their traditional, and I would say like decades-old conspiracy theories that everything bad happening to Russia, and they should find some Anglo-Saxons behind it. So I wouldn't just consider those words seriously. They are just trying to widen the rift between the Europeans and Americans, and actually they're doing a pretty good job, because Trump actually sided with Russia. And I just joked today with my friends that I wouldn't rule out a joint bombing of Russians and Americans of Ukraine, trying to force so-called peace on us.
Well, let's hope not. But it has to be said there's also sort of propagandistic element to what the Russians are saying, because, the implication is, it couldn't possibly be the Ukrainians on their own. Whereas, they must have had help from London. And this ambassador has a long record of being rude and insulting Britain as well. But, Alexander, it is true that even in our own defence review published this week, there is explicit conversation about cooperation on drones between Ukraine and the United Kingdom, isn't there?
Well, certainly, and we highly appreciate the consequent UK governments, starting from 2014, when Barack Obama, Angela Merkel were reluctant to provide any assistance to Ukraine, even though we have this so-called Budapest Memorandum and there were security assurances there. But the United Kingdom decided that the Black Sea is a place of interest for the United Kingdom, and we launched the cooperation in rebuilding Ukrainian naval force. And certainly the United Kingdom has played a crucially important role supporting Ukraine after the invasion in 2022. Not to mention that the UK has been galvanizing the support of other countries and pushing the Joseph Biden administration to support more. So yes, there is a real credit to the UK that you are doing to support us. And certainly the UK industry and the government is willing to cooperate more and strengthen our defense capabilities so that we can withstand this attack and be able to deter Russia in the future.
Right. Alexander Kara, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Really good to have you with us. I guess there will be the hope in Ukraine and among Ukraine's friends that what we've seen this evening, the disengagement of the president of the United States from, the peace process, not that there is a meaningful peace process, that might encourage the others to come in, step up and give Ukraine the sort of support it needs. We'll leave that there. That's another story for another day. Emily Lee, who was our producer tonight, Isaac Marley, our technical operator. Thanks for listening. Kate's up next on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have a great weekend. It is 7 o'clock. It's the evening edition with me, Kate Borsay. Coming up,